Hello and welcome to this new podcast episode presented by the Journal of Medical Device Regulation. We are thrilled to have high-profile representatives of the Australian Competent Authority for Medical Devices, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or TGA, as our guests in today's sessions. Welcome Tracey Duffy and Professor John Skerritt. How are you today?
Well, we're very well.
Please, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your role at the TGA? Ladies first, maybe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Maria. My role at the TGA is to lead the highly specialised and skilled team that look after medical device assessments, as well as that's pre-market and post-market monitoring of medical devices. I also look after the group of laboratory technicians and all of the staff here who do the testing of medicines and medical devices, and also GMP inspections for medicines, any recall actions, and I'm also the management committee member for Australia on the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum.
My role in brief is really threefold. I'm Deputy Secretary for Health in Australia, one of the deputy heads of the Australian Health Department. So part of my job is responsibility for everything to do with health, aged care and sport. On top of that, I have direct line responsibility as head of TGA, and I also have responsibility for head of Australia's Office of Drug Control. Of those three roles, the TGA role probably accounts for 60% of my work, and is some of the most challenging and interesting parts.
Thank you. So obviously, COVID-19 has created many new challenges for the device industry. What have been the biggest challenges for the TGA? Do you think COVID-19 will have any long-term impact on how devices are regulated in Australia, or make the TGA even rethink how it operates?
I might start. So I might start and John might join. So as a small regulator and a small country, we are dependent on international regulator approvals and also supplies of medical devices coming into Australia. Around 80% of medical devices that are supplied and provided in Australia come from offshore. So COVID has had a significant impact on supply chains and accessibility of medical devices. The other issue is because we were isolated, part of the challenge we had was taking on those additional roles that normally we would look at other regulators or other processes to be done other than Australia doing them. So workload and timeframes and access to devices and being flexible in our approach to bring things in quickly and do assessments and not have to rely on overseas assessments was a really challenging time for the staff of TGA and industry and manufacturers as well. We had to find that balance between our usual assessment processes and the timelines of when to make sure that supplies were always available, including, COVID test kits, ventilators and other PPE. And so we wound up with a balanced approach of having some exemption orders in place, followed up with post-market reviews to make sure that all the devices continued to perform as intended and met the claims that were being made by those manufacturers. We saw new entrants. So one of the workload challenges was the establishment of new manufacturers and new entrants into the medical devices industry, both here in Australia, but also new manufacturers wishing to supply to Australia. And that created some challenges because these new entrants may not have had been regulated before or were not used to the Australian regulatory framework. So increasing our support and being able to support new manufacturers was a key opportunity, I think, which we'll see continue.
If I could hit on two biggest changes to how we operate going forward, I think that it's created an expectation that we'll have to meet that we will be working at a much earlier stage with technology developers, whether developers of IVDs, devices, or medicines or vaccines for that matter. That's, and it could be that we'll have many meetings with them, guiding them through the regulatory framework, even providing advice on data requirements and so forth. That's going to require, and has required, quite a significant cultural change, because our staff have tended to be used to getting everything at the end of a product development cycle, and here's a regulatory submission. It also does challenge our model, because our work, for example, on regulation of devices is 100% industry cost recovered. And at least in COVID, we've had 20 discussions with some organisations without necessarily charging them a fee for that. There's also the second big shift is, while we increasingly are playing a greater role as regulators in communications and safety information and education about what the products are and how they're regulated, and why the expectations on us, whether it's through writing technical guidance at one extreme right through to appearing on national TV. We're on national TV several times a week at the moment, which is an uncomfortable place to be. It may not continue as much, but I think there's an expectation that the regulator will have a much higher profile. And the final change is, I think it's shown the value of close international collaboration, which is now something we're doing on a daily basis. It means many of us lose sleep, as I did last night and Tracey will tonight. It's because of where we are time zone wise in Australia. We've just got to convince those Europeans, and of course it comes naturally in Spain, to stay up half the night so we can have a meeting with you in the middle of the day instead.
I thought Australians stayed up half the night also with the good wine that you have.
No, that makes us go to sleep early.
But certainly, I mean, we in Australia and TGA, we had, you know, more than 250% increase in the type of inquiries and support that was required for us to help people understand not only the regulatory requirements, but their ongoing obligations and their ability to, I guess, meet the obligations going forward. So that will continue, I think.
So during the pandemic, Australia experienced a surge in applications for COVID-19 related products, such as face masks, miracle cures, etc., from rather opportunistic companies. A lot of face masks included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods via the TGA's COVID-19 emergency process have in the meantime been removed from the database because they failed the TGA's testing and scrutiny of claims. Face masks are class 1 in Australia and can be self-included in the database without any review by the TGA, I understand. However, non-compliant face masks and false advertising claims about face masks can result in critical negative outcomes for public health and safety. Could you provide some high-level stats on these new entrants and their products? And would the TGA have any comments maybe on the regulations for low-risk class products such as face masks that may be implemented in the future, taking into consideration what has been learned during the pandemic?
Thank you for that question. So I think early on we identified that what you've just described was a challenge. So we worked quickly to put in place some alternative sort of mechanisms. So first of all, in terms of numbers, we received over 2,500 applications in 3 months just for PPE, the majority of which were face masks. And that's obviously large for Australia, but I also have information from other regulators that they had similar sort of huge increases in terms of the applications for these devices. And you're right, a number of the applications were either for products that weren't medical devices and were incorrectly included on the register here in Australia, the ARTG, as a class 1, or were later found through our post-market review to not be able to prevent the transmission of disease between people, or to be used in a healthcare setting in a safe way. And that was of great concern to us. So we put in a multi-pronged approach very early And that included publishing specific guidance on our website about our expectations. And we started a post-market review of all ART Class 1 entries that were available in Australia, including laboratory testing right here in the TGA laboratories to test out the performance of face masks and respirators. We also, on the other end, put an expedited recall process in place so that if there were issues identified, that we could quickly identify them and either put alerts out or recall them and let people know that there was an issue. And we beefed up our compliance efforts with the Border Force to stop some of these products coming into Australia on the borders. And that created a whole range of increased compliance action, including infringement notices and warning letters and so forth. So our post-market review, which is still going, it comprises of a desktop review of the evidence that a manufacturer holds. It also includes laboratory testing here in the TGA laboratories, and we did purchase some new equipment to do that testing. And what we found through that testing was there were some inconsistencies in how both manufacturers and test labs, both here in Australia and internationally, were interpreting the standards. And so we spent a lot of time and effort making very clear what our interpretation is and seeking some guidance and collaboration worldwide about a consistent way of making sure face masks and respirators do actually get tested to the right levels. So making sure that the areas on the mask, all areas on the mask are tested accurately, that the number of samples that are tested are of a validated size, a sample size. And we also made sure that we put in a new Class 1 validation process. So what this means is that instead of a Class 1 face mask going straight through the approval process without checks and balance, there is a check and balance process now included in that before an entry goes through to the register. Now, since that new process has been in place, to give you an idea, of the 150 odd applications for entry, 68 have gotten through the new process. So it is working for that validation.
That's great.
All I'd add is that this is an issue that regulators globally had a dilemma with, but there was a reason why a whole lot of consumables, and face masks are seen as consumables often, were classified as Class 1. And it did enable, especially at the first wave of the pandemic in March, April, May 2020, for products to get onto the market and to be purchased very quickly. We were fortunate, though, that we believe we've hit a sweet spot where we want the documents prior to registering. We haven't changed the regulatory standards.
No.
What we are doing is that so many companies either didn't know that those standards were required, or perhaps they hope that we never actually ask them for that information. And so they would go to market and not actually have the data to support their submission. So now they actually have to show us the documents. So we can emphasize we're not raising the bar, we're just getting evidence that they actually have the evidence before they go to market. And I think that's a good place to be, and it actually will reduce the amount of work needed. As Tracey said, there is still the issue with greater global consistency of standards, and we don't insist on any particular country-specific standard, but it still has to meet standards that support the claims a product make. And I think it also shows the problems with design, and we had a number of new companies that were supported by government to step up in the manufacture of face masks. And I guess in wanting to brand their products, in many cases, they would put logos and so forth on the masks. And sadly, a logo might look very nice, but it was quite often the point where the mask was too permeable to either vapors or liquids. So it might look nice, but it was actually a point of failure on the mask. And I think there's a lesson there that functionality sort of trumps looks, especially with face masks.
And through our face mask review, there's been around 40% of cancellations for a whole range of reasons. It's working, and our hospitals and our aged care homes and anyone else can now have confidence in the ones that remain on the register have been tested and perform as intended.
That's great news. So the TGA is in the process of implementing a significant program of reforms to strengthen the regulation of devices in Australia. Do you think industry has been generally supportive of the changes? Has the reform process run smoothly so far?
I'll take that. Well, the process has started some time ago, and it had the purpose both of trying to streamline and provide opportunities for industry to increase the number of pathways that they could get a product to market. So, for example, we really had, if I go back 5 years or more, we had either Australian conformity assessment of a product or an abridged process using European notified bodies. Now, there were issues there. Some of the notified bodies, as Europe has recognised, varied in quality, and indeed there were many so-called scandals with medical devices, and some of them were quite scandalous. On the other hand, industry did not have clear pathways, for example, of whether there could be similar notified bodies established at a later stage in Australia, how to use overseas regulated information, for example, from countries such as the US or Canada, to mention a few. And also, they didn't have access to priority pathways for devices that could provide a significant clinical benefit over technology that's already available, or IVDs that provide a significant public health benefit. That's really continued with another stream where we're working more closely on alignment with Europe and alignment across MDRF, and Tracey's been very active in leading that. The final piece of work, I think, in recognising the fact that there had been a number of serious cases with certain medical devices where performance turned out not to meet the original expectations and people were harmed by those products, whether it be hip joints, whether it be breast implants, or whether it be urogynecological implants, meshes, and indeed maybe hernia meshes are emerging as another challenge, was the need to actually engage more, communicate more, listen to, and focus on safety. So the final piece was really what we call the action plan for medical devices. Now, while some areas have been slowed down with COVID, there's been significant progress in all of them. The other area of reform in devices, and it seems to be never ending because it is never ending, is really to make sure that the regulatory framework is fit for purpose. We've always had the flexibility to regulate any type of technology, but that hasn't necessarily provided industry with the clarity. And so we had a personalised medical device regulatory framework that really was about eyeglasses and walking sticks rather than 3D printed products. And clearly some of the 3D printed products are mass produced. Sometimes they're quite high risk if they fail. And so we needed a framework that could recognise and regulate according to risk, but recognise and adapt to the changes in technology for personalised medical devices. A similar situation was with software as a medical device. Again, just because something is in software as opposed to a physical hardware medical device, if, for example, it diagnoses or manages something serious, such as a cardiac arrhythmia, the risks that come out of that device not performing appropriately are equal, whether it's a physical device or a software device. That's had the challenge both in cases of the 3D printed products and the personalised medical devices and the software devices of having to, first of all, engage with a sector that in some cases wasn't used to being regulated and indeed felt that it was their right to continue not to be regulated, even though the products may have risk, or alternatively didn't know about a regulatory system. Because the nature of people who might be writing software in universities and in small businesses are actually very different from the large globally integrated companies that may be producing joints or pacemakers and so forth. So we've had to actually work with new industry sectors. We've also had to be flexible and realise that we've got to regulate according to where the risk is. And in many software products, for example, fitness ones that tell you whether you've done 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 steps in a day, or whether the food you eat is healthy or not, there really isn't a need for a device regulator to come on top of what is really a group of consumer products. So we've also had to work on carve-outs. It's been challenging for us because we've had imperatives from government and consumer and dare I say political pressure to implement some changes, such as patient cards, patient leaflets, information leaflets and so forth. And of course, the European changes have been frankly slow in running out, and with the big pressure of COVID in Europe, some have been delayed. So we've had the challenge in some cases of either having to run ahead of Europe in some of these changes, or alternatively try to anticipate what Europe was going to do and try to align with a set of regulations that's still being formed. So it has been a challenge. And the final challenge I'll add is quite often, while our market, because we're only 2% or so of the world device market, says you must align internationally, the question often is, which international should we align with? So for example, if I take the unique device identifier, the systems and the way they're implemented are different in Europe, and the timing of implementation is different between Europe and the US. And yet we've got to make decisions at an early stage of who and how to align. So it's been a challenging journey. It hasn't been without pushback from industry in some parts of industry. Quite often it's the industry that hasn't been used to being regulated that's been upset the most. Generally, the regulated industry has been highly supportive and has taken up the challenge of working with us as a partner to work out sensible systems that both give them access to market but manage safety and performance of devices. The main challenge has been with groups, whether they're groups making dental products or software writing groups, or doctors and surgeons in hospitals who are used to 3D printing things and don't see that regulation should get in the way of their medical practice, but have taken the hardest communication and collaboration tasks. But that's part of our task.
And I think just to add to John, the engagement from the industry has been really high. So over the last 2 years or so, we've had over 30 public consultations, also with some targeted workshops to work through where industry has identified there might be a concern or an issue or a difference between different countries. We've actually taken the time to have those dedicated discussions to work through those things. So I think that is really important for transparency, but it is also really important to explain why, if Australia does do something a little bit different to other regulators, the rationale and the understanding of why and what does it mean going forward. And even with the European changes that are coming through, where we've made decisions to go ahead of Europe, we've always been committed to looking at the impact later on when information and details are more well developed from Europe, to see whether or not it is having a detrimental effect on the arrangements here in Australia and for patients here in Australia.
Yes, as you mentioned a few times, many manufacturers use conformity assessment certificate issued by European notified bodies to support marketing authorization in Australia. How have the issues surrounding implementation of the new EU regulations, particularly the bottlenecks at the notified bodies, affected Australian manufacturers? And what is the TGA doing to help?
So I think the impact has mainly been on manufacturers who are supplying into Australia rather than Australian manufacturers trying to export out of Australia. There are two parts to the answer. There certainly has been significant concern for those device manufacturers who have lapsing certification and they can't actually get a new certificate issued in the timeframes to meet some of the regulatory requirements here in Australia. And We've seen that with some of the classification changes we've made here in Australia before Europe, but also more generally, they are very concerned about the ability to maintain their supply. So we've issued guidance on our website that says that if they have tried to get onto the notified bodies list, so to speak, at their priority list, and they have a letter describing that they've had that initial engagement and they're on the list, we will continue to ensure that supply continues. And we just need to work with sponsors on a case-by-case basis to understand their circumstances and, where possible, make allowances for that. There are some other device manufacturers who have made the decision to come to the TGA to get their conformity assessment certificate. And we've had a number of those applications, both from European based companies and UK based companies, because they haven't been satisfied that they're going to meet the timeframes in their own jurisdiction. So they've come here and we've done the conformity assessment. Now, what that means is that that conformity assessment may not be recognised by all countries around the world. Under the mutual recognition agreement we have with the EU, it can be, some of those certificates can be recognised in certain circumstances while that agreement is in place. And we've put out some additional guidance about how long that will remain. So I think as we keep the industry updated on our website, we're trying to support the ongoing requirements.
What changes in general or in particular can we expect to happen in 2021 or early 2022?
Well, we are very sensitive to the fact that the industry and patients and healthcare professionals have seen a lot of changes and continuous change, and of course have had the turmoil of COVID. And COVID's been interesting in the devices industry. Not as much as in Europe, but elective surgery has been reduced dramatically for a period, and dramatically in some parts of Australia more than others. So we had a very geographical concentration of COVID in Australia, such that the state of Victoria in the south, with Melbourne in it, actually had something like 85% of the deaths due to COVID, and I think something like two-thirds of the cases. And so surgery and the economy was much more significantly affected there. It's our second most populous state at 5 million people. Other parts were hardly affected, such as in Western Australia. So device manufacturers, depending on what segment of the market they were selling into. So if you were selling into dentistry, people just were not going to the dentist for 6 months last year in some parts of Australia. Other parts actually did very well, especially if you were selling face masks or tests or swabs or whatever. But so the industry's been through its own fair bit of turmoil, and we've had to recognise that. So in some cases, we have gone a little bit more slowly, such as with the European alignment. Having said that, where patient safety or improvements to the system, and they're both our top objectives, are key, there's no excuse for just doing nothing. And so we have already started and there's transition periods in some cases, some not, the changes to software as a medical device and to 3D printed personalised medical devices. So some new companies coming in with new products have to commence right away. Others with established products have a period to transition. And supporting industry through that period of transition will be a key priority for 2021. We are also working, I talked about safety before, we are also working on post-market changes. So improvements to the reporting of adverse events, both in terms of our software systems, but also whether all the current exemptions to reporting are appropriate. We're currently undergoing some initial work on whether, as in countries like Canada and some European countries, there should be mandatory reporting of adverse events in healthcare facilities. The government, that's a decision not by us. We are regulators. We implement the policy decisions of our elected government. And so our role is to conduct the consultation, to get the feedback, and then see if government decides it's a good idea. We've got to watch the additional regulatory burden here. And so the how, whether there's a way to implement greater reporting of adverse events without significantly increasing the burden on organisations is a key thing. The implementation of a unique device identifier is actually a key reform over the next few years. We also have a commitment that from July the 1st, if companies do want to apply to act as Australian conformity assessment bodies, the system will be there. Now, we have no idea whether there'll be 0 companies or several companies wanting to do that, but a policy decision and a change of the law has said that there will be a system for that. There's a number of devices such as surgical meshes for hernia and so forth that will be reclassified during the course of this year, and other things roll out such as patient information cards for established implanted devices. So it's still and there's a number of other changes through to the regulation of in vitro diagnostic tests that have been rolled out, such as allowing, for example, greater use of self-testing for certain conditions. So it's still going to be as busy a year as ever in the device area, and just as interesting as just as challenging. But I think the interest of working with healthcare professionals, patients, and I would say that we'll also, the final thing I'll say about the coming year or so is that we'll see a lot more work with patient groups. Rather than maybe, frankly, something that regulators do as an afterthought, the involvement of patients will become more central to our decision making, to our communications, and we've seen that with our work on breast implants. So an exciting year ahead.
It sure does sound like it. Thank you very much for this very informative session. I have personally learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has learned a lot too. It was lovely talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.